Am I on? Thank you very much, Fabio. And that was a terrifically interesting presentation from Randy, and I'm going to pick up on a number of the topics, particularly the ones that we've just begun to talk about. Let me talk in a very broad way to start with about the challenges for communications policy in the digital age. And let me begin by just telling you a very small amount about ourselves. So we are the communications regulator in the United Kingdom for the whole of the converged space. So everything from content, radio and television on one side, right the way across to all the networks on the other side. And now, interestingly, also involved in things like illegal downloading as well. So very much involved in the internet aspects of networks as well. I've put up on this slide the 5 priorities or strategic objectives we have in Ofcom. I won't read them all out. You can see them on the slide, but they sum up what we are trying to do, and I think they also sum up the breadth of the challenges which face any regulator or indeed any policymaker who is thinking or trying to think about and address the challenges of the converged age. Just very briefly, so you will not be surprised to see promoting effective and sustainable competition at one end, nor making markets work for consumers, something that I do want to touch upon, but also on the right-hand side, as you look, something which I'll elaborate on a little bit more, often concerned with content and citizen-type issues, contributing to and implementing public policy. So we have a close relationship with our Parliament, and we're completely independent of our Parliament, but sometimes the Parliament sets us tasks which are there to deliver certain outcomes for people, for society in general, as well as people as individual consumers. I'd like to cover 3 broad areas. What we think of as the interconnected age, something we're all familiar with, and I'd just like to highlight 1 or 2 points there. Some emerging challenges for policymakers, and then just touch briefly on the global dimension. Let me kick off with the interconnected age. So here is a slide which just illustrates how we think about this. We like to have in Britain, we like to have a historical perspective. We've got a long history, and it's always rich. It's always a rich experience to go back into it. And this is just a very simple summary of the communications history, certainly in our lifetimes. And we start on the left-hand side with the analog age. We move through the digital age. You're all very familiar with those ideas. Into the on-demand age, which is I guess what we've been in for a little while now in one form or another, and then into the interconnected age. And Randy began to pick up these issues, I think, that I'd like to touch upon as well. 4 big areas that we think about in that context. Over-the-top stream services, which I think represent a central challenge of our age. In other words, what do they mean, not just for consumers, but what do they mean in terms of policy challenges? Fibre to the home, I've put fibre to the home simply because that is now the aspiration at some point for many societies and many countries. It may take many years to get there, but if you talk to any highly informed policymaker, they tend to say, well, we want fibre and we want ultimately to take it to the home. That's a huge investment challenge, but so too is 4th generation LTE. So simultaneous or in parallel, a big investment challenge on the mobile front as well. And then, of course, the kind of cloud services that we've just been discussing. I'll just highlight some of the background to that very quickly. I don't want to dwell on these particularly, but the rise in IP-based services inevitably meaning that the content people want is no longer connected to any network or any particular device. A very simple concept illustrated by the rise in take-up here on a whole variety of different networks in the UK. A common story in many different countries. Similarly, the demand for speed going up and up. On the left-hand side, future mobile demand, various predictions there. I think the key thing here is the staggering rise of likely demand for mobile data. You can take whichever prediction you want in this area and debate it for as long as you want to do so, but the core story remains the same, and that is that the level of demand is going to rise exponentially. Wherever people are deploying mobile networks, that is going to be the case. So the central challenge which emerges from it, I think, is clear regardless of the debate about the precise speed. And on the right-hand side, UK broadband speeds. It's not there in particular to make a point about the change over time. It's there merely to illustrate that we do expect that to go up and up and up. And at least in our country at the moment, we don't anticipate a direct substitution between mobile and fixed. I know that will be the case in some countries, but at the moment we anticipate fixed offering a much, much faster rate of service and therefore staying as an alternative, as a complement to mobile services for the foreseeable future. Now those, in a sense, are well-known stories. I think what has become very, very interesting to us is to think about the challenges that we face and think about it in the context of a much more complex value chain than the one that I began with when I started looking at this area many, many years ago. But also a value chain which I think has become much more interesting, much more dynamic, much more challenging, really in the last 5 years alone. And if you look at the heart of this slide, what we've done is just simplify that value chain to content supply on the left-hand side, packaging and delivery, what we might call television channels historically on the right-hand side, and then distinguish between data transfer and data hosting in the middle. And again, picking up the cloud debate, you can't just think now about data transfer, i.e. networks, without also now beginning to think about data hosting, in other words, the cloud. So we think about both now almost in parallel, particularly for reasons to do with market power, which I'll come on to in a moment. Now, even on that simplified view of the value chain as we engage with it today, you can see the range of companies that we're having to think about. No longer do we think about the fixed bottleneck telco. And I think this is very much in tune with some of the comments Randy was making. We cannot now say, well, we believe there is a straightforward, conventional fixed line, wireline monopoly with significant market power, and there's no other story taking place here. That is really a very, very old-fashioned way of looking at the world. What we do need to look at and understand, even though as a regulator we may have no direct influence, we may have no direct regulatory responsibility, we still have to understand that broader world and the dynamics of that broader world with some of the companies that I've noted on that slide. At the heart of this, and indeed guiding our own thinking in this area, is the idea that consumers, by which I mean ordinary individuals, households, and of course businesses, will want anything, anytime, anywhere. That is the promise which the interconnected age offers. And it's a promise which is very important for policymakers and regulators, not only to share the aspiration of, but to not get in the way of. There are some things which we may be able to do to facilitate and help drive that vision, but there are also some things which we could do badly, which would stand in its way. I've illustrated the direction simply by showing you the level of activity, the range of activities conducted on smartphone by UK adults. Again, commonplace to any society now where smartphones have any significant take-up. And again, the key point here is just the direction of travel. However far this is exhibited in your country, in our country, it is only going to go in one direction, and that is going to be more and more a diverse and broad range of services enabled by these devices and the networks that support them. So the anything, anytime, anywhere vision is one that I think we share and one which we should be helping enable. Let me turn to some emerging challenges then. The way we think about emerging challenges inside our own organisation is just through this very simple layout, this very simple set of tasks. And I'll touch on each of these individually, but as you can see, working from the top, there is a big network investment challenge. I hear people say, oh, well, the investment will take place, the companies will have to do it. I don't accept that. I think there is a massive network investment challenge, both in wireline and in wireless, and we need to be very attuned to that. There's a big consumer challenge, a new set of consumer challenges in this day and age that are different to those of the past. Challenges in content funding, in competition, in how we protect viewers, very important in many societies, certainly in our own, and in how we deal with spectrum. And indeed, it is spectrum that I just want to start with, at the first of these emerging challenges. I've talked about the exponential rise in demand, and again, that is a very familiar story. The questions here are how one deals with it, and there are some very interesting tensions. If you look at the right-hand side of this slide, you see three ways of dealing with it. One is to find more spectrum and release it, and we're doing plenty of that. Countries across Europe, across the world are doing plenty of that. But we also need to expect and demand more efficient technology, so more bits per megahertz. And there is an interesting tension sometimes between the two. If there is simply more spectrum on offer, then to what extent are there sharp incentives to make spectrum more efficient? And one answer to that, which we employ, is obviously to auction that spectrum to make sure it has a price. And then how do you deploy the most efficient network model, in a macro and micro sense, to also deliver that increased supply? Network investment, I mentioned as a big challenge, and I regard it as one. Here is a quote which is from the European Commission. Our European Commission's ambition is to match world leaders like South Korea and Japan. Europe needs download rates of 30 megs for all citizens, and at least 50% of European households subscribing to internet connections above 100 megs by 2020. Now, let's just agree that at the moment that is a stretched target in Europe. There is a long, long, long way to go. The really difficult question lying underneath this is whether we have devised the right combination of policy and regulation and capital markets, in a sense, to deliver the investment to meet that kind of aspiration. And what it feels like, certainly in the UK, but also I would say more generally in Europe, is that the answer lies somewhere between a mix of public and private. Largely private. We think there are very strong reasons to believe that private sector investment can and will deliver some very substantial multi-billion dollar levels of investment for these kinds of networks, but they are unlikely to deliver the kind of universality which politicians across Europe regard as essential. It's not necessarily essential tomorrow, but certainly essential over the next few years. And it's hard to see how the market alone and how private sector investment alone will deliver quite that level of deployment. So certainly in the UK, and I know in other European countries, the approach that's taken has been market-led, private sector investment-led, thinking very carefully about the incentives for that investment and the policy framework for that investment, but supplemented at the edges of that market deployment with public subsidy to ensure rollout to as many people as possible to cover rural areas as well as urban areas. I said I wanted to just mention the new consumer challenges, and I think these are different, and what I've tried to do here is illustrate how we thought about them in the past and how we're beginning to think about them today and in the future. In the past, in a sense, quite straightforward. Single services, we just bought voice. 12-month straightforward contracts. You owned your own content. It may have actually been your voice, or it may have been something else that you owned, maybe a DVD. And the key question was price competition. Today, some 45% of UK consumers take a bundle of services. That number is going to go up and up and up. So it isn't just voice anymore, whether it be mobile or fixed. It's content as well, often a bundle of 2, 3 or 4 services. Because of the radical changes in devices and the fantastic innovation in that area, contracts, certainly in Europe and very much in the UK, have changed to subsidise the handset. As a consequence of that, contracts are much longer, people are tied in for much longer. That presents all sorts of problems and challenges. People have started renting content, we've touched on that, so that throws up all sorts of questions, security being one of those challenges. And a whole plethora of loyalty schemes and benefits have emerged to supplement price competition. All of this has one characteristic that is different today than in the past, and that is complexity. And complexity is a challenge for consumers when they are locked in to long-term contracts. Content funding is, I think, another big challenge. It's a big challenge because in this dynamism, in this turbulence, the old model that many countries, and certainly our own, relied upon, of a virtuous circle between investment and content, viewing, generating mass audience revenues, feeding back into content, is going to increasingly come under challenge. That fragmentation that people mentioned is going to pose challenges in that area. So, of course, is illegal access to content and all the copyright issues. So for the first time really in my lifetime, there are significant questions about the virtuous circle that has created really quite substantial and attractive levels of content investment in many countries across the world. And that is, to my mind, one of the great challenges of the next 5, 10, 15 years. And competition. And one of the reasons that I asked Randy the question that I did was because this, to me, is one of the genuinely great questions that we have to think about. Organisations like my own were born of the idea that there was an easily definable bottleneck, a monopolist or a company with very substantial market power. And that was easy. We knew what it was, we knew how to regulate it, and we broadly got on with it. And there's a whole set of new questions about that now. The first and most obvious is whether that is still the case. And whether, as Richard asked, whether the progress of infrastructure competition, intramodal or intermodal, whichever phrase you wish to use, has made the kind of progress which raises the questions about whether that kind of regulation should stay in place. Whether mobile is a genuine substitute and can challenge that definition of market power that we've used in the past. And I think most intriguingly of all, if you go back to my engagement with this broader, more complicated value chain, whether the emergence of very powerful organizations of different kinds, whether they be in the operating systems area, whether they be in the device area, or wherever they be in that value chain, whether that creates a situation of countervailing market power, of strength, such that we can begin to think about commercial negotiation and that conventional balance of power between very, very big companies as an alternative to more conventional approaches to regulation. That's not necessarily, I'm not necessarily advocating that, but those are the kinds of questions which I think emerge. And they are particularly relevant when we are looking towards the more traditionally regulated companies to make very substantial investments. It isn't a world in which we can just stand still and say, well, we're going to carry on regulating you exactly as you were, even though we now expect you to make multi-billion-dollar investments into whole new networks. There has to be a prospect of a credible return Indeed, I would say a healthy return, a return related to the level of risk being taken for those kinds of companies. And that does raise all of these questions. I mentioned content assurance. It's important for me to do that because we are a very converged organisation. We have to think about not just investment in content, but also the protection of audiences in this world. And again, that has been historically very easy for us. People watch television at home. We could regulate that television. It was licensed services, and we could provide an assurance to audiences about what they would be able to watch. As everybody I think knows, in an age of connected TVs where the first action may be to go to Google and search YouTube or any other portal for video content from anywhere in the world, providing that assurance in the living room for the ordinary family with children is a very, very big challenge of the future. It's a challenge that I would perfectly happily admit to not knowing the answer to yet. The one thing that I'm absolutely clear about in this area is that the zeitgeist of some years ago, which said that the internet is the internet, it cannot be regulated, and this technological tsunami will sweep away our content regulation in this area, is wrong. In my view, societies who value this kind of protection for their audiences, for families watching at home, will assert their right to ensure that that remains the case. And they will demand solutions to that rather than hold their hands up and say there can be no solution. And finally, the global dimension. I think this is an absolutely critical question. When you think about some of those challenges and those questions that I've highlighted in the last few minutes, there is an additional final question, and that is how best to tackle them. And there are obviously three dimensions. There are global approaches which sometimes will be necessary, the ITU being a great example, spectrum being perhaps the most obvious example, where one has to think not only locally, not only by region, but also internationally, globally. There will also be examples where regional cooperation is essential. The body of European regulators is a good example of that, which I think is making very good progress to ensure there is a coordinated approach to regulation across the European Union. But I do not think that we will ever lose the importance of national specificity, which understands national economic markets, but also national cultural expectations. So the truth in this area is that it is going to be a little bit more difficult because I don't think any of these problems will be solved without both a national, a regional, and a global dimension. So for people like myself, regulators and policymakers involved in these challenges, the future looks extremely interesting, but without doubt more difficult than the past. Thank you very much.